Hi, it's Jan Howell. Welcome back to my channel. I have another sewing tutorial for you showing you how to gather fabric using a regular sewing machine. In a previous tutorial, I showed you some really nifty tips and tricks on how to use a serger to gather fabric. But what if you don't have a serger? These two methods that I'm going to show you on a sewing machine, I think you'll find helpful and maybe something you haven't seen before. Stay tuned to the end of the video because I'm going to show you how to apply a ruffle to another piece of fabric that might come in handy for some other projects. So let's get right into it. I have cut several strips of muslin fabric, just cotton fabric, to practice on and to show you. Grab your scissors, some strips of fabric, a seam ripper, or you can use a pin, and some dental floss. Let's go over what the settings on your sewing machine needs to be. I'm using a straight stitch, and we want the length of the stitch to be as long as you can. Now my machine will go up to 5, so I'm going to use that. Some machines will just go down to 4.5 and that, or 4. Anywhere from 4 to 5 will be fine. And the width is 0, of course, because we're just doing a straight gathering stitch. Before you start sewing, grab the needle thread and the bobbin thread and just pull them out so there's a long tail. Your fabric strip, line up the edge with the edge of your presser foot, and we're not going to back stitch. Sew with that long gathering stitch all the way down to the end. When you get to the end, lift up your needle, lift up your presser foot, and pull the fabric out so you leave a long tail of thread on this side as well. Cut that, and we're going to sew 2 different rows 1/4 inch apart. Now you could gather this up and that would be fine, it would gather it quite nicely, but sometimes when you're gathering, one of the threads might break, especially if you're doing a long project. So the reason we do 2 rows and sometimes even 3 rows is to secure that, and it also allows that ruffle and gather to lay a little bit more flat when you're pinning it onto your project. Let's go over the presser foot. Most presser foots will have these little lines on it. Let's see if you can see that. There's 3 different little notches there, or I could move my needle over so it's in line with this. That way I'll get that 1/4 inch. So whichever way you want to do it, we're going to sew that second stitch 1/4 inch away from that first stitch. And if you want to do that optional 3rd row, you can do that. So one thing to be aware of, you don't want to cross over and touch that first stitching, or else it will mess up the gathering. So it doesn't have to be exactly straight, but you don't want to get close to or gather into that first row. Leave that tail. A reason you might sew that 3rd row is if you're sewing on a thicker fabric and the thread has a more prone chance of breaking when you're using a thicker fabric, or if you're using a sheer fabric, sometimes having that 3rd row will just help it lie a little bit more flat when you're pinning it on something, like I mentioned before. Grab your seam ripper, and we're going to separate the top needle thread from the bottom bobbin threads. So it's like this. And I'm going to just let those top threads come to the left, and I'm going to grab the bobbin threads. When you pull the bobbin thread, it seems to just slide so much easier. So you just start pulling it and see how it starts to gather. And if you have a really long ruffle, you can gather from one side and then gather from the other side if you wanted to. But for this small of a project, I'm going to separate these 2. And a trick, now some people will tie these off to keep it from keep sliding off as you gather. So here's a little trick, is to take the top threads on the other side and give it a little pull. Then when you gather, it locks it. See how that is not gonna slide off. And then I'll just continue to pull those bobbin threads. So once you decide how the width that you want the ruffle to be, and you don't want it sliding off, grab the top threads and just give them a little pull and see how that locks it. And then you'll apply it to whatever you want to do. All right, let's move on to the second method. Grab a piece of floss and make it about 5 inches longer on each end than the piece of fabric that you're trying to gather. Before I go to the sewing machine, let me just explain what we're going to be doing. I'm going to leave a tail of the floss, and then I'm going to bring it up just about, your 3/8 of an inch from the edge. And we're going to be zigzagging across back and forth over that piece of floss. You could also use a small gauge crochet thread as well. But floss is cheap, it's easy to use, and it works really well. It won't break. So for the second method, we're going to change the stitch on our sewing machine to just a basic zigzag stitch. And I'm going to adjust the width at 4.5 and the length at a 2. Grab your piece of floss, leave that 5 to 6 inches of a tail, and bring your presser foot down, and you want that center point of where the needle is going to go back and forth. And you can just turn your hand wheel of your sewing machine a few times to just make sure that stitch is wide enough and that thread is in the center. Start sewing your zigzag stitch and keep that thread in the center as you sew. So I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot and zigzagging over the thread. When you get to the end, don't backstitch, lift up your needle, and you can go ahead and clip your thread. And now what we're going to do is come to the left side, take your 2 threads, and tie a knot with that strip of dental floss. So keep that from coming undone. And all you do is grab the dental floss and start gathering. It does such a nice job. Again, decide how much you want the gather to be, flatten and even out. So you'll want to leave a tail of threads there so you'll have something to tie it off of. Clip off the floss. A good time to use this method is using fabric that's a little thicker and a longer piece of ruffle. So you can just kind of play with both of these techniques and find what works best for the project that you're on. Let me show you how you would attach a ruffle to a piece like a waistband or a pillowcase or a skirt or something. After I have got it the width that I want and spaced out evenly, I'm going to attach both sides with these clips. And you'll want to place the right sides of the fabric. This you really can't tell the right side, but if this were the right side, I'd place it towards the right side of the waistband or the fabric that I'm attaching it to. It's the width that I want, but I want it to be spread out evenly. So I feel like that's pretty good. I'm going to clip that or pin it in place. I'm going to go back to my sewing machine, change the stitch back to a straight stitch. I'm going to center my needle, and then I'm going to change the length back to just a normal 2.5. You want the ruffle to be on top so that you can control where the ruffles are and keep it straight. Bring my presser foot down. Don't worry if one of those gathering stitchings is on the outside of your seam, because we're just going to pull those out. Back stitch at the beginning and the end of your seam. You can adjust as you sew, and it's nice to just take that left hand and keep that smoothed out as you sew. Of course, you'd be using thread that was similar to the fabric that you're using, but this will give you an idea of what that will look like. And if you wanted to, sometimes I use contrasting color of thread, then it's easier to find the stitching and pull it out. So all you do is just take your seam ripper, grab those threads, and just pull them out. So once you have all the basting stitches out, this is what it looks like on this side, and this is what it looks like on that side. You can always add a bigger seam allowance, which a lot of projects will have that bigger seam allowance, and that probably would have avoided having for you to unpick that extra row. And then when you press that, you'll just press the gathers towards the waistband. Pretty nice, pretty simple. So I hope that was helpful and that you learned something new and you're ready to make gathers on your sewing machine. If you have a serger and you want to make ruffles and gathers on your serger or overlock machine, make sure you check out that video tutorial. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do that. Click on the bell so you can be notified when I put new tutorials up. If you want to brush up on your sewing skills, check out my Sew Simple course. I'll put the link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. Get out your sewing machine and make something fun. We'll see you next time.